Content warning. This episode addresses sexualized rituals and practices of control that may be unsettling. Imagine being 18, your hair braided tight against your scalp, your linen dress pleated and starched for a night that everyone tells you will mark your passage. Torches line the approach to the temple courtyard. A low chant hums at the edges of hearing. Family members move and rehearse steps. Voices offer blessings that sound at times like instructions. You are led not toward a banquet, not toward a private room of affection, but into a smaller, curtained space within the temple precinct. A sealed chamber where a group waits, where an object, draped and deliberate, stands like a witness in the corner. The celebration around you is a performance. The purpose beneath it is verification. This script centers on temple servants in ancient Egypt and reconstructs, with caution and respect for the limits of our sources, how ritual and bureaucratic logic could be woven into intimate moments. Where direct Egyptian evidence is absent, what follows is a cautious reconstruction informed by comparative practices and the broader archaeological and legal record. Those moments are flagged as hypothesis or marked indefinito. Comparative examples from other cultures, when invoked, serve as methodological blueprints rather than proof that identical rites existed in Egypt. If this subject matters to you, please subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. It helps us bring more of these hidden histories to light. The public face of the ritual: ceremony, song, and social pressure. In the open courts of the temple, the evening begins like many other communal rites. Torches spill light across carved pillars, casting the reliefs in a flickering, unreal motion. A procession forms: relatives, attendants, a handful of temple functionaries. The young woman walks between two elder women, perhaps a mother and an older servant, her veil arranged to show respect but not entirely to conceal. Music is modest: hand clapping, monotone chanting, the gentle rhythm of a society used to marking life's passages with communal attention. From an outsider's vantage, the ritual resembles other rites of passage: public recognition of social status shifting, blessings invoked for fertility and prosperity. But embedded in that display is a different framework, one that treats the body not merely as a person, but as evidence. In ancient societies where inheritance, land rights, and social standing depended on clear genealogies and uncontested lines of descent, the ritualization of bodily status was not merely moralizing, it was procedural. Marriage, transfer of property rights, and a woman's social fate could hinge on a moment of validation carried out under religious sanction. We must be careful here. The precise specifics of a so-called virginity test or a formalized examination of a temple servant's sexual history in Egypt are indefinable in the surviving textual and archaeological record. Papyrus fragments, legal papyri, and temple inscriptions do attest to the importance of lineage, dowries, and contractual obligations tied to unions. They also attest to the role of temples as centers of administration and ritual authority. From those two facts, the temple as bureaucratic religious center and the legal emphasis on lineage, a plausible reconstruction emerges. Rites that combine the symbolic, the religious, and the procedural to produce socially recognizable testimony about a woman's status. Where I describe procedures below, treat them as interpretive reconstructions, not as direct reproductions of a documented Egyptian script. Procession and public performance masked private purposes. The public ceremony established two things at once: a social story and an official context in which private verification could later be accepted as authoritative. Witnesses were present to lend weight to whatever testimony the temple authorities would record. The crowd's applause, the mother's final admonition, these were not pure expressions of joy. They were social pressure, calibrating the woman to the performance she was about to undergo. Into the sealed chamber, the emblem and the frame of the test. After the public ritual, the atmosphere tightens. Torches are carried into narrower spaces. The air smells of oil and reed smoke. Curtains are drawn. Close friends and family remain outside. A smaller circle of temple personnel, attendants, and perhaps a midwife or examiner follow the young woman into the curtains room. A draped object sits in one corner, a fertility emblem or ritual figure, its exact form indefinable. We cannot responsibly name a specific Egyptian cult image here without evidence. The emblem should be read as a symbolic stand-in, a charged object whose presence confers the rites sacred imprimatur. What matters in this room is the shift of roles. The ceremony moves from outward pageant to inward verification. The temple supervisor, title indefinable, who oversees ritual order, stands near the emblem. An attendant arranges the woman's veil or seat. Eyes that had watched the procession now become witnesses in a different register. Their purpose is to provide testimony later, to be depositions of sight and ritual compliance. The ritualized actions that follow, what one might call symbolic contact or ceremonial gesture, are described here in measured terms. There is a formalized sequence. The woman is positioned, an action is performed that carries symbolic meaning of submission or passage, and the emblem receives some ritual acknowledgement. Think of this as a staged event designed to produce a recognizable sign to observers. What is crucial is not the physical specifics, which we do not and cannot reconstruct with certainty, but the function, to convert a private bodily state into a public, religiously sanctioned testimony. In other words, the ritual makes the body legible to law. Cleansing and medical verification, the attendant, the midwife, and testimony. Following the symbolic sequence, the next phase is a private verification that, as reconstructed, would involve an attendant or clinician figure, midwife, examiner indefinido. Textual evidence from Egyptic papyri that survive is fragmentary on this topic. Explicit descriptions of intimate examinations are rare and often oblique. Anthropological parallels from other ancient societies show that communities often outsourced controversial or intimate verifications to specialized attendants, midwives, elder women, or temple therapists, who combined medical knowledge, ritual authority, and social standing. In our cautious reconstruction, the midwife's role is both practical and procedural. The term verification is preferable to any graphic vocabulary. Attendants perform cleansing rites, apply ritual oils, or arrange linen. They may observe, using established gestures, signs, or criteria that their community recognizes as indicating a particular status. These actions are not described here in intimate detail out of respect and to avoid sensationalism. Their operation should be understood as a ritualized form of examination. Ritual gestures configured to yield evidence authoritarian institutions accept. The legal or social document that follows, if a record is produced, is as important as the physical action itself. In societies where administrative records confer status and where witnesses can be summoned before councils, the presence of temple or local officials and their written or oral testimony converts an event into a legal fact. Papyrus contracts from later periods in Egypt show an attention to formal statements, witness lists, and sealed attestations. If an examiner or temple supervisor recorded that the rite had been performed, their word could settle disputes about dowries, legal rights, and a woman's place within her marital and social network. Here, it is useful to make a comparative note. Roman examples of ritualized proof attached to marriage practices, which we study not to claim direct equivalence but as a methodological blueprint, often mixed public performance, witness testimony, and private verification to create incontestable social facts. Using those Roman structures as a model helps us imagine how an Egyptian temple, as both a ritual and administrative center, could stage similar sequences. Again, this is a comparative method, not evidence that Roman scripts were used in Egypt. Documentation, witnesses, and the bureaucratic logic of control. Rituals like the one we reconstruct functioned within an administrative logic that treated persons in part as legal objects. Law in ancient societies frequently sought certainty. Who would inherit? Who could claim a title? Which household could make legitimate demands? Temples were often central nodes in these processes. They preserved records, performed oaths, witnessed transactions, and generated the testimony that made private experiences legible in public forums. Witnesses are the linchpin. A small group of temple attendants, perhaps an elder woman who served as an arbiter and a scribe or official who could affirm the rite's completion, together transformed an embodied event into a documented fact. The testimony had power precisely because it was embedded in sacred authority. A declaration that the rite had been performed carried not only legal weight but the sanction of the temple. For families seeking to secure alliances, to confirm dowries, or to ensure the eligibility of a woman to bear legitimate heirs, such testimony was invaluable. Yet that bureaucratic efficiency came at a human cost. The ritual's function is clear when we consider the incentives at play. Controlling the line of descent secures patrimonial assets for male heirs. Verifying a woman's sexual status reduces uncertainty about paternity. Public testimony prevents later contestation. The woman herself rarely benefits from this bureaucratic certainty. Her body becomes a site where property and kinship relations are verified and where silence is institutionally enforced so that the records, once created, remain unchallenged. The emotional mechanics, shame, compulsion, and enforced silence. What was the interior life of the young temple servant who underwent such a rite? We cannot recover a private diary in most cases. What we can do is reconstruct probable emotional trajectories based on the structures that framed her life. Rituals that require demonstration, inspection, or the staging of body-based evidence impose profound social pressure. Shame is not simply an emotion, it functions as a mechanism of social regulation. When rituals transform intimate facts into public testimony, they institutionalize pathways that produce shame, compliance, and silence. Compulsion could take many forms: explicit coercion by family and temple authorities, subtle social pressure grounded in the necessity of economic survival, and the theological framing that tied family honor and religious blessing to demonstrated purity. The temple servant might have believed she had little choice. Refusing the rite could jeopardize her marriage prospects, her family's economic security, or her acceptance within the temple community. Even when the rite produced documentation that ostensibly served the woman's social standing, the power asymmetry remained. The ritual preserved and reinforced gendered control. Enforced silence followed the rite. A record, once produced, eliminated the need for the woman's testimony. In effect, it replaced her voice with the temple's voice. Her future questions about her own body, her desires, her agency were subsumed by the administrative certainty that the rite generated. Over a lifetime, this could translate into muted griefs and stories that never entered the public record. The emotional labor of carrying that silence is as real as any physical act performed in the curtained room. The afterlife of rites, erasure, transformation, and historical invisibility. Temples and legal systems change. Conquerors come, administrative practices evolve, religious priorities shift. Many rites that mattered at one time can disappear from the visible record for reasons unrelated to their previous centrality. Material objects decay. Texts are burned or repurposed. Later scribes may find a rite embarrassing, inconvenient, or politically dangerous and simply omit earlier practices from new narratives. Additionally, the moral and political climates of later periods often shaped which histories were preserved. Practices surrounding women's bodies, rituals of verification, and institutional controls were frequently rendered invisible because they could not be reconciled with new theological frameworks, or because later elites wished to distance themselves from earlier institutional violence. Thus, the absence of a full documentary account in surviving Egyptian sources does not mean such rituals did not exist. It means the traces that would confirm them have been lost, transformed, or suppressed. Where evidence is absent, therefore, we say indefinido and treat reconstructions as provisional. When surviving fragments do appear, they often arrive in unexpected forms. a legal papyrus that mentions witness lists, a burial scene that hints at specialized priestly roles, an administrative ostracon that identifies temple personnel responsible for record-keeping. These fragments allow scholars to build models that can be tested against material culture, iconography, and the comparative practices recorded in other ancient civilizations. But uncertainty remains, and it is an ethical requirement of historical practice to voice that uncertainty explicitly. Who benefits from the ritual? Power, property, and gendered control. The structural beneficiaries of such rituals are clear. Male kinship lines and patrilineal inheritance systems gain clarity and security when a woman's sexual history can be ritualistically certified. Temple institutions reinforce their authority when they act as the arbiter of such claims, thus consolidating both spiritual and administrative power. Elite families whose marriages secure alliances or land rights benefit from the documented certainty that reduces the risk of later disputes. Women, including the temple servant at the center of this reconstruction, generally stand to lose autonomy in this arrangement. If the ritual secures a husband for her, it does so by subjecting her body to communal judgment. If the ritual allows her family to claim a dowry, that financial security is itself mediated by the temple's authority. Rarely does the woman control the narrative about her own body. The ritual is not designed to empower her perspective. It is designed to render her physical status legible to others who will use that information to allocate resources and social standing. Comparative insights, methodology, and caution. At this point, it is worth reiterating the methodological caution. By examining Roman or Near Eastern examples where ritualized verification appears in better documented form, scholars build comparative frameworks that help hypothesize about similar institutional logics in Egypt. Roman practices, for example, sometimes formalize the conversion of private acts into public testimony, mixing witnesses, symbolic acts, and medical or elder attestations. These patterns offer a template for understanding how Near Eastern temple structures, institutions with both spiritual and administrative power, might have performed similar functions in different cultural languages. However, these comparisons are not evidence of identical practice. Language, theology, legal structures, and social norms differ. What is useful is not a one-to-one mapping, but a structural analogy, a way to see how ritual could produce administrative facts, how temples could function as both sanctuaries and registrars, and how bodies became sites of both spiritual meaning and legal evidence. The human coda, imagining a lifetime after the rite. Return to the young temple servant who entered the curtained room. After the ritual and the supposed verification, life proceeds with new certainties imposed from without. She may enter a household where the terms of her life, duties, marriage, expected childbearing, are set by the documents and testimonies produced in the temple that night. She may carry the ritual's residue in small, persistent ways: an unease around authority, a learned silence when private matters are discussed, a sense that public rituals have the capacity to override personal truth. We should avoid simplistic moralizing. People in the past acted within complex webs of obligation and belief. Some participants may have believed that the rite protected family honor or secured a woman's future. Others may have resented and resisted it. But it is crucial to censor what is often invisible in the surviving record: the interior experience, fear, resignation, shame, endurance that no bureaucratic note could capture. The temple's testimony may have settled disputes, but it could not encapsulate the full personhood of the servant who had to live with the consequences. Silence and memory: why the stories vanish. Why do we not find fuller accounts of these rites in the record? Several reasons converge. First, the fragmentary survival of papyri and inscriptions biases our view. Second, institutions tend to preserve administrative language while erasing the embodied voices of those whose bodies were acted upon. Third, changing moral orders renders some practices embarrassing or verboten, leading later scribes to edit or omit sacramental histories that no longer fit prevailing ideologies. This combination of material loss and intentional erasure produces a historical silence, not an absence of truth, but an absence of documented testimony by the very people who experienced the rites most intimately. Recovering those stories requires sensitivity to fragmentary evidence, an ethical imagination to reconstruct probable experiences without inventing details, and a willingness to say indefinido where evidence fails us. Final reflection: what this past tells us about control and memory. The case of a ritualized verification administered to temple servants in ancient Egypt, whether reconstructed in partial form or attested in direct fragments, speaks to a broader human pattern. Societies create procedures to reduce uncertainty. They vest religious institutions with administrative authority. They ritualize proof when social order and patrimonial transmission are at stake. The result is often a legal religious machinery that treats human bodies as means to an administrative end. Understanding these dynamics helps modern audiences see how control over bodies is not a modern invention. It is woven into deep strands of social life. But recognizing the continuity of mechanisms of control should not lead us to excusing them. Instead, it should sharpen our attention to the human suffering that such procedures can produce, and to the ways in which silence is manufactured across generations. A cautious, humane historical practice also insists on transparency. Where details are indefinido, we say so. Where reconstructions draw on comparative evidence, we label them as such. Where sources exist, they should be cited and made available for scrutiny. If you want the research notes and the sources that inform this reconstruction, the papyri, the archaeological reports, and the comparative studies, check the description below. If this story raised questions for you about how ritual, law, and gender intersect in other societies, let us know in the comments what you'd like us to explore next. If you found this reconstruction helpful, please like, subscribe, and check the description for source links and further reading.